The town's favorite ice cream jingle hid a nightmare no one smelled, except a scarred canine who wouldn't stop barking. Watch what happens when his warning rips the mask off a sweet summer tradition. The sun hung heavy over the small town, spilling golden light across the cracked sidewalks and the neat rows of maple trees that lined Main Street. The air carried the sweet smell of melting chocolate and waffle cones, drifting from the brightly painted ice cream truck parked at the curb. Children rushed toward it with coins clutched in their hands, laughter ringing out as they bounced on their toes, waiting for their turn. Parents stood nearby, chatting, half watching, half lost in the easy rhythm of a summer afternoon. The truck itself was a picture of comfort, its jingling tune familiar, its driver smiling behind the counter as he scooped out colorful swirls of ice cream into paper cups. Everything felt normal, safe, as it had countless times before, until Rex stopped moving. The German shepherd's paw froze mid-step, claws scraping against the pavement. His ears shot forward like twin arrows, his hackles rising in a ripple down his back. For one long moment he simply stared at the truck, his amber eyes locked on the painted side panels with the cartoon cones and popsicles. Then his chest swelled and a sound ripped from his throat, a deep bark that cracked the air like thunder. It wasn't playful, not the kind of bark a dog made at the promise of food. It was sharp, guttural, urgent. It carried warning, the kind of sound that silences a crowd. Every child turned at once, startled, a few clutching their ice cream tighter as if the treat might fall. Parents' conversations broke off mid-sentence. Some instinct older than language told them to pull their children back, and they obeyed without thinking, arms reaching out to drag little bodies away from the curb. The joyful tune of the ice cream truck stuttered against the sudden tension, the notes thin and hollow. Officer Daniel Hayes braced himself against the leash wrapped around his wrist. He had worked with Rex long enough to know the difference between noise and meaning, and this was meaning. His partner's muscles strained like wire, his body lunging toward the truck, claws scraping, teeth bared. Hayes dug in his heels, voice low but steady. "Easy, boy, easy," though his heart already knew it was not nothing. The crowd stared now, eyes wide, waiting for someone to tell them whether this was danger or just a dog's whim. The driver inside the truck gave a thin laugh, though it sounded forced. "Guess your mutt doesn't like sprinkles," he said, trying to play it off. But Hayes saw the way his hands tightened on the wheel, the way his smile twitched too fast across his face. Rex barked again, louder, snapping jaws toward the thin metal panel of the truck's side. His body vibrated with certainty, a living alarm that would not be silenced. The air, once thick with sugar and joy, now tasted of nerves. And in that moment, the town understood. The dog was not wrong. Something about the truck was wrong. Daniel Hayes had always trusted the dog at his side more than he trusted most people. In his 10 years on the force, he had learned that a canine's nose and instincts often saw past the things human eyes missed. Rex had saved him once already when a suspect tried to pull a hidden weapon during a routine stop, and Daniel never forgot the way the shepherd had lunged without hesitation, taking the hit that would have been his. Since then, there was no doubt in his mind, if Rex was barking like this, it meant something was wrong. Hayes tightened his grip on the leash, the leather hot against his palm, and forced his voice calm even as his pulse hammered. He lifted his radio, pressed the side button, and said, "Unit 6, requesting immediate backup, possible code 9 at Main Street, north side by the ice cream truck." His words clipped but tense. The families around him shifted uneasily, their chatter gone. Mothers pulled children behind them. Fathers watched with narrowed eyes, the summer light suddenly sharp instead of warm. Some of the kids began to cry, confused why the dog they had seen in parades, the same one who always posed for photos in his vest, was now snarling and lunging at the painted truck that had always promised sweetness. Rex was not a dog who barked at shadows, and the townsfolk knew it. His reputation carried weight here, built over years of quiet service. The driver in his bright white paper hat and striped shirt shifted uncomfortably on the high seat. His hands curled tighter around the steering wheel, knuckles pale, jaw working beneath a smile that looked plastered on rather than natural. "What's the problem, officer?" he called out, his tone too loud, too casual. "It's just ice cream, same as always." He even tried to laugh, but the sound broke halfway through. Daniel's eyes tracked the way sweat formed along his temple, a single bead sliding down and catching on his collar. Rex barked again, a sound like a gunshot that made the youngest child wail. Hayes lowered a hand to his partner's back, feeling the rigid muscles quiver with tension. He leaned close, speaking low. "I hear you, boy. I hear you." He had learned long ago not to dismiss what the shepherd tried to say. The dog's nose twitched furiously, sucking in scents the humans could never catch. Something under the sweet layer of vanilla and syrup, something chemical, sharp, foul. Hayes straightened and placed himself between the crowd and the truck, hand raised in a quiet command for them to stay back. The driver shifted again, one hand reaching toward the gear shift, as though ready to bolt. Hayes's free hand went to his holster in warning, his voice firm now. "Keep your hands where I can see them." The crowd fell into an uneasy hush, the only sound Rex's relentless growl, steady and deep. Hayes's instincts screamed in time with the dogs. This was not about cones or jingles. This was about danger. And whatever it was, it sat hidden in that truck waiting to be uncovered. For as long as anyone could remember, the truck had been part of the town's summers. Its sides were painted with giant smiling cones and cheerful blue swirls that made it look more like a rolling carnival than a simple food van. The jingle it played was old and scratchy, yet still carried a tune every child could hum by heart. Parents grew up with it, grandparents too, waving at it during parades, buying cold treats after baseball games, standing in line at fairs where the sun burned down and the smell of popcorn mixed with sugar in the air. It was not just an ice cream truck. It was a piece of tradition, something that felt safe simply because it had always been there. That was why Rex's sudden outburst had cut so deep. People who had trusted that sound, who had smiled at the sight of its painted doors, now stood frozen with doubt. The dog's growl still echoed in their ears, as their eyes moved over the truck's details as if seeing them for the first time. The bright decals seemed too bright now, almost mocking, the smiles painted on the cones stretching wide in a way that felt wrong under the hot Sunday. A murmur went through the gathered crowd, confusion layered with fear, because when something so familiar suddenly becomes suspect, the world tilts out of balance. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, asking why Rex was angry, why he wanted to attack the place where the treats came from. Mothers shushed them. Fathers frowned, none of them sure what to say. They wanted to believe it was a mistake, a fluke. Maybe the dog smelled spilled milk or meat from another delivery. Yet deep down they knew nines did not misfire. Rex was trained to detect danger that hid beneath surfaces, and he was rarely wrong. The driver kept trying to smile, tossing a half-melted popsicle from one hand to the other, but the way his eyes darted from Rex to the officer betrayed him. His fingers tapped the steering wheel in a quick rhythm that did not match the lazy jingle spilling from the speakers. People noticed, though no one spoke. Silence grew heavier by the second, broken only by the low hum of the engine and the occasional bark from Rex, as if he refused to let anyone forget what was at stake. Old Mr. Callahan, who had lived on the street for 50 years, whispered to the woman beside him that he remembered when this truck first rolled into town, how the children had chased after it like it was magic. Now his voice cracked as he said he never thought he would see the day a police dog would turn that same magic into something frightening. The woman nodded, clutching her son's hand tighter, eyes fixed on the bright paint that now looked less like joy and more like camouflage. Trust was fragile, built on years of habit, but shattered in a single moment by the sound of a bark that told everyone in that summer street that the beloved truck they thought they knew might be hiding something far darker than sprinkles and smiles. Rex lunged with such force that Daniel Hayes nearly lost his grip on the leash. The German Shepherd was no longer just barking at the truck in general. He was dragging his handler straight toward the left side panel, claws scraping lines into the asphalt as he pulled. His nose slammed against the thin, painted metal, and he pressed hard, sniffing with quick, desperate bursts. A low whine rumbled from deep in his chest before it broke into another round of furious barking, louder than before, sharp enough to make the children still lingering with their parents cover their ears. Hayes crouched beside him, steadying the leash with one hand, palm resting on the tense fur along Rex's spine. The muscles beneath his hand vibrated like a live wire, every instinct in the dog screaming that something inside was wrong. The driver leaned out of the window, trying to keep his voice light. "Guess your pup doesn't like sprinkles," he said with a weak chuckle. But the sound lacked warmth. His eyes darted too quickly, his hands clutching the edge of the counter with unnatural stiffness. Hayes caught the glimmer of sweat rolling down from his temple, cutting through the pale powder of sugar dust that clung to his cheek. A man with nothing to hide would not look like that. Hayes's own pulse picked up, the radio at his shoulder crackling faintly as distant units confirmed they were on the way. The crowd was silent now, held in the uneasy grip of uncertainty. Parents kept their children behind them, some stepping farther back onto the grass. The cheerful jingle from the loudspeaker continued to play on a loop, the same broken tune that had always drawn kids running, but against the dog's barking, it sounded warped, almost sinister. Rex snarled again, pawing the panel so hard the metal groaned, and then he sat back on his haunches, staring at Hayes with a steady, unblinking gaze. It was the signal they had practiced countless times in training, the signal that said there was something here, something hidden, something dangerous. Hayes rose slowly, eyes never leaving the driver. "Step out of the truck," he said, his voice calm but carrying steel. The driver tried to laugh again, shaking his head. "Come on, officer. It's just a truck, just a little sugar, nothing more." But the tightness around his mouth betrayed the lie. Rex barked once more, the kind of bark that seemed to demand the truth. The driver flinched at the sound, his hand slipping slightly on the steering wheel as if it burned him. The first crack in the mask was visible to everyone now. The cheerful paint, the smiling cones, the paper hat perched on the driver's head. None of it could cover the tension bleeding through his every movement. Hayes felt the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. The dog was right, he knew it in his bones. Whatever was inside that truck was not meant to be seen, and yet Rex would not stop until it was dragged into the light. Sheriff Laura Monroe's cruiser glided onto the street, with its lights cutting through the warm haze of the summer afternoon. The siren was off, but the pulsing flash of red and blue washed across the faces of parents clutching their children, and it gave the moment a weight no one could ignore. Monroe stepped out with the quick efficiency of someone who had seen enough scenes to know when things were about to go sideways. Her eyes went first to Daniel Hayes, reading the tension in his jaw, then down to Rex, whose body looked carved from stone, hackles raised, muscles rigid, nose pressed toward the painted panel of the truck. In a heartbeat she understood this was no misunderstanding, no false alarm stirred up by a nervous dog. Something was wrong, and it was serious. "Everyone back," she called, her voice sharp but steady, the kind of tone that made people move, even if they didn't want to. Parents obeyed, pulling their children further away from the curb. Some tried to carry cones still dripping down their wrists, but most let them fall to the sidewalk, where the heat quickly turned them into sticky puddles. The children whimpered and cried, confused why a summer treat had suddenly become something frightening, why the trusted truck now stood behind a wall of uniforms. 2 paramedics arrived, hauling equipment from the back of their rig. They did not ask questions, only set up near the edge of the crowd, ready in case whatever Rex had sensed turned violent. Monroe scanned the scene, her hand resting near the holster on her belt, her gaze landing on the driver. His forced smile had faded, leaving behind something strained and pale. His fingers still tapped against the wheel, though now the rhythm was erratic, frantic, betraying nerves he could not hide. Hayes gave a small shake of his head toward Monroe, a silent message they had exchanged countless times before. He trusted the dog. She nodded once in reply, acknowledging what she already believed. Rex had never been wrong. She turned to the deputies who had followed her in. "Lock down both ends of the street," she ordered. "Nobody in or out until we get this cleared." Boots thudded on asphalt as they moved to block traffic, and the once ordinary road where children laughed now looked like the site of a crime scene. The ice cream truck's jingle played on, a broken loop that no longer sounded cheerful but instead eerie, like a carnival tune echoing in an empty lot. Rex snarled at the sound, his bark cutting through the thin music like a blade. The driver twitched, his eyes flicking from the sheriff to the crowd to the dog, as if calculating how much longer he could keep up the act. Monroe's lips pressed into a thin line. The illusion was gone, melted away with the cones that lay abandoned on the sidewalk. This was no longer summer joy, it was something darker, and Rex had been the one to pull the curtain back. The driver's face had gone pale beneath the brim of his paper hat, his eyes darting between the deputies closing in and the crowd watching from a safe distance. His voice rose as if volume could mask fear. "It's just ice cream," he shouted, the words tumbling out too fast, too sharp. "That's all I've got in here. Just popsicles and cones for the kids." His laugh cracked at the edges and died in his throat when Monroe stepped closer, her boots steady on the pavement, her expression unreadable. She had been on the job long enough to know the difference between nervousness and desperation, and this was the latter. Dogs don't bark at vanilla, she thought, and the tension in Hayes's shoulders told her he was thinking the same. Hayes glanced at her, his hand firm on Rex's leash, and gave a small nod. It was all the confirmation she needed. "Let him work," she ordered, her voice calm but carrying the kind of authority that silenced even the murmurs of the restless crowd. Hayes loosened the leash and gave a quiet command. Rex surged forward with purpose, every inch of his body focused, his tail stiff, nose pressed close to the asphalt as he moved. He circled the truck slowly, step by step, inhaling the scents layered beneath the sticky sweetness that lingered in the air. Children and parents watched in tense silence, their summer dream unraveling as the shepherd's dark shape moved like a shadow of truth around the brightly painted van. The driver's protests grew louder, shriller. "This is crazy. He's just sniffing sugar and syrup. You people are making a mistake. I've been serving this town for years." His voice wavered, each word thinner than the last. Monroe did not answer him. Her eyes stayed on the dog, on the way Rex's ears flicked, the way his movements sharpened as he rounded the back doors of the truck. He stopped for a breath, nose pressed against the metal, then continued along the side panel with quick sniffs. The street felt like it was holding its breath. Finally, Rex halted at the middle of the truck's right side, his head lowered, nose locked onto a faint seam in the panel. His muscles tensed. For a moment he stood frozen. Then, with deliberate calm, he sat down, his gaze fixed forward, his body still as stone. The bark did not come this time. The silence was louder than any sound. It was the train signal, the clearest message a canine could give. He had found contraband, and whatever it was hidden behind that thin wall of cheerful paint. A ripple of shock went through the crowd, gasps mixing with whispers. Monroe stepped forward, her hand lifting as she gave the order for deputies to secure the vehicle. The driver's face collapsed into panic, his fingers tightening on the wheel as if he could somehow hold the truth inside by sheer force. But the illusion had already been stripped away. Rex had spoken without words, and his message was final. Something dangerous was hidden in plain sight, and it was about to be revealed. The deputies moved quickly once Monroe gave the order, their boots pounding against the asphalt as they surrounded the truck. The driver's protests rose higher, his voice cracking as he shouted that they needed a warrant, that this was madness. But no one listened. Hayes kept one hand firm on Rex's harness, the other near his holster, his eyes never leaving the metal doors that had for years swung open to hand out scoops of vanilla and chocolate. Today those doors carried a different weight, and the dog at his side was trembling with a fury that made Hayes's skin crawl. The first crowbar screeched against the latch, the sound sharp enough to make the children in the crowd whimper. The driver shifted in his seat as though ready to bolt, but two deputies flanked him, weapons drawn, voices low and steady, warning him to stay put. Another wrench of steel, a final snap, and then the doors swung wide. The illusion of sweetness vanished in an instant. A stench rolled out that made the deputies gag and step back, hands over their noses. It was not chocolate, not sugar, not anything that belonged near children. It was the sour tang of rot, layered with a chemical bite that burned the back of the throat. Even Monroe, hardened by years of grim scenes, had to swallow against the bile that rose in her chest. The crowd gasped, some turning away, shielding their children's eyes, though none of them knew yet what they were shielding them from. Rex's growl rumbled low and dangerous, his teeth bared, his hackles bristling down the length of his back. Hayes felt the vibration of it through the leash, a sound that was more than anger, it was recognition. The shepherd stepped forward, nose twitching rapidly, pulling his handler closer to the darkness inside. The deputies raised flashlights, and the beams caught on rows of metal coolers stacked and chained to the floor. They did not hold ice cream. Their surfaces were dented and stained, their locks heavy, their purpose anything but innocent. One cooler at the end had not been secured properly, its lid loose from hurried handling. As a deputy nudged it with his boot, the top slipped open with a dull clang. For a moment, no one breathed. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in a thin blanket, small enough to make the deputies freeze. Then the fabric shifted. A tiny hand twitched. A faint whimper broke the silence. The scene erupted with motion. Paramedics rushed forward. Monroe barked orders into her radio, and Hayes tightened his grip on Rex, who strained forward, eyes locked on the cooler as though he had known all along what lay within. The crowd behind the barricade broke into cries, parents clutching their children tighter, some sobbing openly. The driver slumped against the wheel, his paper hat sliding to the floor of the cab, his mask finally shattered. There would be no more talk of sprinkles or smiles. What had been revealed was far from dessert, and it was only the beginning of the secrets Rex had dragged into the light. The coolers gleamed under the harsh beams of the flashlights, their metal sides slick with condensation and grime. At first, the deputies thought maybe it was food storage gone bad, maybe illegal meat or spoiled milk, but then the scattered details began to stand out. A corner of fabric sticking from one lid, bright cartoon prints that did not belong to any kitchen. Another cooler rattled faintly when nudged, and inside something rolled. Not ice, not dessert, but a toy. A small plastic car with chipped paint. The sight made one deputy's throat close, his light trembling as it swept over more of the containers. Vials lay tucked into a corner, labels half torn, syringes floating loose among them. Confusion turned to dread. No one could piece it together until the blanket in the half-open cooler moved. The smallest sound escaped from within, a weak moan that seemed to echo across the street louder than any siren. A deputy fell back 2 steps, voice breaking as he shouted, "We've got kids in here." His words ripped through the gathered crowd, pulling gasps and cries from parents who clutched their own children close, some burying faces in their shoulders, as if by not looking they could block out the truth. But Rex would not allow that. The German shepherd barked furiously, his body straining forward, tail rigid, ears pinned. His voice carried an urgency that demanded attention, as though he were saying without words, "I knew it. Don't look away now." Hayes's throat tightened as paramedics surged past him. The first cooler was carefully pried open, and a child no older than 7 was lifted out, pale, weak, his breathing shallow but steady. A gasp rolled through the crowd as mothers covered their mouths and fathers stood rigid with fury. The boy's small arm dangled limp until a medic wrapped him in a clean blanket and checked for vitals. His eyelids fluttered, his lips parted, and the faintest sound escaped him, the sound of life. Other coolers followed, lids pulled open with dread, each revealing the same heartbreaking truth. Small bodies, curled under thin blankets, toys scattered as if meant to comfort, bottles of medicine stacked alongside them. Each child alive, though weak, each one stirring as fresh air reached them. Deputies stumbled back in shock, some whispering prayers, some muttering curses, all shaken to their core. Monroe's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and steady, calling for more ambulances, calling for federal backup, her face grim as she kept order in a moment that threatened to spiral. The driver sat slumped in the cab, head hanging low, hands cuffed behind him now, the mask of the friendly ice cream man stripped away completely. His silence spoke louder than any excuse could. Hayes looked at him once, then turned away, his focus on Rex, who remained locked on the children, barking until the last of them had been pulled free. The dog's chest heaved, his amber eyes fierce, as though he had carried this knowledge alone and now demanded that every human around him bear it too. The summer afternoon had shattered into something unthinkable. The beloved truck, once a symbol of joy, had carried a horrifying cargo. And because one dog refused to ignore the smell of secrets, those children now had a chance to see another sunrise. Black SUVs rolled into the quiet town like a dark tide, engines humming low and steady, tires crunching against the summer pavement. The flashing lights of local cruisers reflected in their glossy sides, and the crowd parted as men and women in dark jackets stepped out with practiced precision. The letters FBI glinted in the late sun, and in the center of them all walked Agent Claire Donovan, a woman with steel in her gaze and lines of experience etched into her face. She took in the scene in one sweep, the coolers stacked in the truck, the pale children wrapped in blankets on stretchers, the driver slumped in cuffs, and the dog pacing like a soldier guarding his post. "This isn't just a truck," she said grimly, her voice carrying across the silence that had fallen. "It's a pipeline." The words sent a ripple through those gathered, deputies shifting uneasily, parents clutching their kids tighter. Even Sheriff Monroe, who had seen her share of darkness, felt a cold weight settle deeper in her chest. This was bigger than their small town, bigger than one smiling man in a paper hat. This was organized, planned, and carefully hidden beneath layers of paint and jingles. Paramedics moved quickly, lifting the children from the coolers and placing them gently onto stretchers. Their small hands clutched toys they had been found with. A stuffed bear here, a cracked plastic doll there. Items that should have lived in bedrooms, not in locked metal boxes chained to a floor. The children were alive, weak but breathing, and every parent who watched felt tears sting their eyes, even if they did not know these little faces. The sound of ambulance doors closing carried hope and heartbreak in equal measure. Rex would not leave them. His leash trailed loose from Hayes's hand as the shepherd paced alongside each stretcher, sniffing, whining low, checking with sharp eyes that every child was accounted for. When one boy stirred and coughed, Rex pressed his nose gently to the child's arm before moving to the next. Cameras flashed from the edge of the cordoned street, reporters already swarming, but the dog ignored them all. He was a sentry, his body taut, his purpose clear. He barked at the sight of a cooler not yet opened, forcing deputies to pry it wide, and inside they found another child, still breathing, saved because Rex refused to let the work end too soon. Agent Donovan crouched near him, studying the dog with something close to respect. "He knew," she murmured, almost to herself. Hayes nodded once, pride and weariness mixing in his voice. "He always does." The wail of sirens rose again as ambulances pulled away toward hospitals, their red lights fading into the horizon. The small town street that had once been filled with laughter and the promise of treats was now a battlefield of truth, and at its center stood a scarred German shepherd, chest heaving, amber eyes fierce, the hero who would not let a single secret stay buried. The man who had once smiled at children while handing out cones now sat in a gray chair with his wrists cuffed to a steel table. His paper hat was gone, his striped shirt wrinkled and stained with sweat, and the clownish grin he wore on the street had fallen away like cheap paint in the rain. His name was Gerald Pike, and when the files began to stack in front of him, the story of who he really was came into view. Arrests in other states, sealed records, connections to names already under federal watch, and phone logs that traced back to suspected members of a national trafficking ring. For years he had hidden behind sprinkles and smiles, using the trust of a community to cloak his crimes. Now the mask was gone, and what sat before them was not a jolly vendor, but a predator who had built his empire on children's laughter. Agent Claire Donovan stood behind the glass of the interrogation room, her arms crossed tight over her chest. She had seen men like Pike before, slick operators who thrived on false warmth, but there was something about him that made her jaw tighten. He was too calm, too calculating, even as the walls closed in around him. He tapped his fingers against the table in slow rhythm, his eyes darting to the mirrored glass, as if he knew he was being watched and enjoyed the performance. Hayes stood beside her, his hand resting on Rex's harness. The shepherd's ears were up, his body tense, his gaze locked on the man inside. "Bring him in," Donovan said, her voice steady. They led Rex into the adjoining room, not to confront Pike directly but to let him sit across the glass, close enough to hear, close enough to react. Hayes guided him to a position where his shadow fell over the one-way mirror. Pike's eyes flicked up, and for the first time, a crack showed in his expression. He sneered, muttering something under his breath. But the moment his voice rose loud enough to carry, Rex growled. It was not a loud growl, but a deep rumble from the chest, a sound that vibrated in the walls and made even the seasoned officers in the observation room stiffen. The growl grew sharper when Pike leaned closer to the glass, his voice oily as he said, "That mutt doesn't scare me." But his hands betrayed him, twitching against the cuffs, tapping faster, faster, as if to drown out the sound. Rex's teeth bared, his amber eyes glowing with a ferocity that pierced through the barrier. Every officer in the room swore later that the sound that came from the dog chilled their blood more than any human threat could. It was a sound of recognition, of memory, of truth. Pike tried to smirk, but his lips faltered. The dog's stare was unblinking, relentless, and Hayes knew what his partner was saying without words. The mask was off. Gerald Pike could pretend all he wanted, but the German shepherd saw straight through him, and no amount of lies or forced smiles could ever cover the stench of what he had done. The ice cream truck sat in the impound lot, under heavy guard, its cheerful colors already dulled beneath the glare of floodlights. Agents circled it with cameras and tools, every inch treated as evidence. What had once been a rolling symbol of summer joy now looked like a carcass waiting to be dissected. The air was tense, each investigator aware that the secrets inside this truck stretched far beyond the borders of the town. Every latch, every panel, every hidden compartment was pried open. Coolers had revealed their terrible truth, but the agents suspected there was more, something woven into the very heart of how the operation had survived unseen for so long. Agent Claire Donovan stood with her hands on her hips, eyes narrowed on the box that still hung near the driver's seat, the one that played the familiar tune children had followed for years. She tilted her head, listening to the faint hum that lingered even with the truck powered down. "It's not just music," she said quietly. "That sound is carrying something else." Her team moved in at once, scanning the device, running detectors across its wires. Numbers flashed on their screens, signals bouncing, encrypted data spilling through channels disguised as a song. The box was more than nostalgia, it was communication, a mask that had hidden messages about pickups and drop-offs in plain hearing. Rex, restless at Hayes' side, whined low and pulled against his leash. Hayes frowned, letting the shepherd climb into the cab where the device hung. The dog pressed his nose to the jingle box, ears pricked, body tense. Then he raised a paw and struck the speaker hard enough to send a sharp crack through the air. Hayes moved forward, ready to pull him back, but Donovan lifted a hand. "Let him work," she said. Rex clawed at the panel again, metal bending under the force of his paws, until finally the front of the box splintered open. A small cascade of wires and plastic fell loose, and with them a hidden compartment clattered onto the seat. Hayes crouched quickly, pulling it free. Inside were flash drives, folded maps marked with symbols, and printed schedules coded with names and dates, proof enough to unravel an entire network. The agents swarmed, documenting every item, their faces pale but focused. Donovan exhaled slowly, her voice low but firm. "This is it. This is how they kept the machine running. And now we have it all." News spread within hours. Screens across the nation lit up with headlines about a small-town dog who had blown open a trafficking ring hidden behind the mask of an ice cream truck. Footage of Rex barking, of children being carried to safety, of agents carrying boxes of evidence flashed on every channel. Families who had once waved at that jingle with blind trust now stared in horror. But they also saw hope. They saw a German shepherd who refused to let secrets stay buried. Rex had not only saved children, he had forced a country to open its eyes, and in doing so, he had torn the music of lies apart forever. The town square had never seen a crowd like this. People filled every corner of the street outside the station, their faces pale from shock yet softened with relief. The children who had been saved were still in hospital care, but their parents stood together, holding photos and candles, whispering prayers of thanks for what might have been lost forever. Reporters lined the sidewalks, their cameras flashing like fireflies, recording every moment for a country that had been shaken awake by the truth. And in the center of it all stood Rex, chest broad, coat gleaming under the late afternoon sun, his vest shining with the emblem of service. He did not bask in the attention. He did not preen for the cameras. He simply stood steady, eyes forward, the living image of a sentinel who had never wavered. Sheriff Laura Monroe stepped forward with a small velvet box in her hands. Her expression was solemn, her voice carrying over the hushed crowd. She spoke of trust, of how it had been broken by the mask of an ice cream truck, and of how it had been restored by a dog who refused to ignore what others could not see. When she knelt before Rex, her knees pressing into the warm pavement, she lifted the medal from the box and placed it gently around his neck. The crowd erupted into applause, some cheering, some weeping, the sound rolling across the square like a tide. Daniel Hayes stood at Rex's side, his hand brushing the shepherd's fur, his throat too tight to speak. When he finally leaned close, his voice cracked as he whispered, "You saw what none of us did." His words were not for the cameras, not for the crowd, but for the dog who had been his partner, his protector, and now his town's savior. Rex turned his head slightly, ears flicking, as if he understood. His eyes locked on Hayes with that same steady light, and Hayes felt a lump rise in his chest so heavy it almost hurt. Behind them, deputies worked quietly as the last pieces of evidence were loaded away. The once beloved truck, now stripped of its cheerful decals, was towed down the street. Its bright colors had been peeled off, its sides bare metal once more, and it looked less like a treat and more like a hearse carrying the weight of betrayal. People watched it go in silence, the image searing itself into their memories. Never again would the jingle of an ice cream truck drift through the town without reminding them of the day their children were almost stolen. But they would also remember the bark that had stopped it all. Rex lifted his head then, chest rising with a deep breath, and released one sharp bark. It cracked through the air like a verdict, like a warning, like a truth no one could deny. The crowd went still. Every face turned toward him, and then applause thundered again, louder than before, carrying gratitude and awe in equal measure. Rex stood firm at the center, the hero who had barked at lies and refused to be ignored. Thank you for watching this video of A Dog's Devotion. If you liked this story, Show your support with a like. And join us by subscribing for more inspiring stories like this one.